The morning of May 12, 1989, began like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. Sunlight spilled lazily over the neatly trimmed lawns, touching the faded rose bushes and the lattice fences with a soft golden hue. Birds perched on telephone wires, their songs harmonizing with the distant hum of early traffic. Children played in driveways, their laughter bouncing off the brick facades of tidy houses, oblivious to the weight of what would soon unfold. In house number 17, and Fletcher moved through her morning ritual with the rhythmic precision of someone who balanced care and obligation with quiet grace. She brewed coffee while humming a tune she had learned in her own childhood, the scent of cinnamon and toast drifting through the house. Her children, Emma and Jacob, squabbled lightly over crayons and comic books, unaware that this ordinary morning would be the last they would ever share fully with her, and had planned a simple trip to the nearby grocery store. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second thought. The list in her hand was brief: milk, bread, eggs, a few cans of soup. She had been to this store countless times, smiling at familiar cashiers, exchanging small talk about the weather and local gossip. But that day, something invisible seemed to press against the edges of the ordinary, a subtle tension that no one could articulate. Her husband, Mark, kissed her on the cheek as she picked up her bag, a gesture so familiar it barely registered. "Be back before lunch," he said, words ordinary in their cadence but resonant in hindsight. And smiled and nodded, her eyes catching the morning sun for a fleeting second, the glint of it reflecting a life that would abruptly vanish. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with gentle chaos, the whir of sprinklers, the scrape of tires along asphalt, the occasional bark of a dog. And steps were steady, purposeful, as she walked down the narrow sidewalk toward her car. She unlocked it, the metallic click echoing faintly in the quiet street. She slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror with habitual care. For a moment, she paused, hand resting on the wheel, a faint furrow on her brow. There was nothing outwardly alarming, no threatening figure in sight, no sudden gust of wind to hint at danger, but the air seemed charged with a subtle, ungraspable unease. The kind of unease that only makes sense after the fact, when the mind searches desperately for explanations that may never exist. And started the engine, its rumble small but comforting, filling the car with a familiar resonance. She pulled out of the driveway, waving to Mrs. Gallagher, the elderly neighbor tending to her azaleas, who waved back with a smile, and merged into the sparse morning traffic, her hands gripping the steering wheel in the habitual rhythm of someone who had navigated these streets hundreds of times. A soft radio melody played, fragments of words and notes drifting unnoticed through the car's interior, accompanying her on what should have been an ordinary errand. There was nothing remarkable about her movement, nothing to suggest that this mundane journey would fracture the lives of everyone she loved. Minutes passed, the scenery shifting from the orderly symmetry of Maplewood to the slightly busier streets leading to the grocery store. And stopped at a crosswalk, glanced both ways, and then proceeded, unaware of the invisible fracture that had begun to slice through the day. The store's fluorescent lights flickered as she entered, the jingle of the door announcing her presence to a clerk whose attention remained on a stack of receipts. She wandered down the aisles with practiced ease, filling her cart with the familiar items, arranging them neatly as she had done countless times before. She smiled at the child clinging to a mother's hand, at the elderly man examining the produce, at nothing and everything all at once. Somewhere, just outside the perimeter of these ordinary interactions, the threads of her life began to unravel. Perhaps it was a glance in the wrong direction, a shadow that lingered too long, an unnoticed reflection in the polished tiles of the store. And paused by the dairy section, reaching for a carton of milk. Her fingers brushed against the cool plastic, and for an imperceptible moment, she hesitated, looking toward the door as if drawn by an instinct she could not name. Then, as suddenly as she had entered, and Fletcher disappeared. Not with a scream, not with a struggle, but with a quiet absence so complete that the store remained filled with the sound of shoppers, the squeak of carts, and the hum of fluorescent lights, unaware that life had shifted irreversibly in one quiet moment. By the time her absence was noticed, the simplicity of the morning had dissolved into confusion. A clerk called out her name, a few heads turned, and a child's cry punctuated the ordinary noise. Emma and Jacob would return from their small adventures around the house to a silence that gnawed at the edges of reason, a silence pregnant with unanswerable questions. Mark would feel a chill in the air, an almost imperceptible tremor of dread, as he realized the ordinary errand had become an extraordinary absence. The ordinary morning, the everyday ritual, had fractured into a mystery that would linger for decades, leaving behind a void that no amount of explanation could ever fill. The house at number 17 felt impossibly empty the moment and did not return. The familiar sounds of breakfast dishes clinking and the hum of conversation were replaced by an oppressive quiet, the kind that presses against the walls and settles into every corner. Emma and Jacob, still too young to fully understand the concept of disappearance, wandered from room to room calling her name. Their voices, high-pitched and tentative, reverberated through the empty house like fragile echoes, met only by the indifferent walls. The sunlight streaming through lace curtains fell across the kitchen table, where crumbs of toast remained, untouched and abandoned. Every small, ordinary object, a coffee mug, a notebook, a stray sock, suddenly felt loaded with absence, as though they themselves were witnesses to the sudden fracture in life's continuity. Mark, her husband, returned from a brief errand, expecting the mundane, the sound of children's laughter, the smell of warm toast, and soft humming from the other room. Instead, he was met with silence. At first, he assumed she had been delayed, perhaps caught up in conversation with a neighbor or distracted by an errand. But as minutes stretched into hours, an unfamiliar knot of dread tightened in his chest. He searched the house, calling her name with increasing urgency, each repetition eroding the calm reassurance of earlier hours. The walls seemed to contract around him, the ticking of the clock amplifying the silence, each tick a heartbeat that echoed the mounting fear. Neighbors began to notice the unusual tension radiating from the house. Mrs. Gallagher, standing behind her azaleas, whispered to a passing friend, "She left to run errands, but she never came back." The words traveled like a current, shifting through the community and leaving in their wake a mixture of disbelief, worry, and the beginnings of rumor. Some wondered if and had left voluntarily, others feared foul play. The uncertainty clawed at the edges of normalcy, and in those first hours, the simplest gestures, the closing of blinds, the locking of doors, the turning on and off of lights, became desperate attempts to assert order against the creeping chaos. The children, unaware of the full weight of what had occurred, experienced a more visceral confusion. Emma, the older of the two, ran from room to room, searching for her mother's familiar presence. Her small hands touched the edges of furniture, the fabric of chairs, the cold surfaces of counters, as though by contact she could summon and back from wherever she had vanished. Jacob, younger and more instinct-driven, wandered into the garden, calling into the empty air, hoping for a response that never came. Their fear was raw, unfiltered, a mixture of longing and disbelief. Every familiar corner of the house now held the tension of absence, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mark's frustration mounted alongside his fear. He dialed the local police, his hands trembling as he explained the situation, trying to maintain the appearance of calm while his voice cracked in disbelief. The officers, polite yet constrained by protocol, took notes, offered reassurances, and promised immediate investigation, but their words floated like hollow echoes against the gravity of uncertainty. Mark felt a profound helplessness, the kind that gnaws at the mind in long stretches of waiting, a helplessness that transforms the ordinary into something menacing. Friends and extended family arrived, bringing casseroles, hugs, and whispered reassurances, yet none could fill the gaping emptiness left behind. Days bled into nights with agonizing slowness. The children, no longer soothed by routine, found themselves suspended in a liminal space where time seemed meaningless. Bedtimes were punctuated by whispered questions, "When will Mommy come back, and did she forget us?" Mark tried to answer, his own voice quivering under the weight of grief. The home, once a sanctuary, now carried an almost unbearable tension. Rooms that had once been warm with laughter became monuments to absence. The empty crib, the unwashed dishes, the neatly folded laundry that had left mid-task. Each detail was a reminder of the invisible rupture that had reshaped their lives. Neighbors and friends rallied in quiet ways, some bringing meals, others sharing memories of Anne. These recollections, though well-intentioned, only amplified the family's grief. Anne's laugh echoing through the living room, her hands moving deftly in the kitchen, the tender glances she shared with her children. Every memory was a double-edged sword, sweet in recollection but painful in its reminder that she was gone. Conversations that had once been casual now revolved around her absence, each neighbor tiptoeing around the unspoken fear that something terrible had occurred. As the first week passed, hope began to fray, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that settled deep into the bones of the household. The children's school routines continued, but their small faces carried shadows that no playground chatter could dispel. Mark found himself pacing the floors at odd hours, checking doors, scanning streets, revisiting every detail of that ordinary morning in a desperate search for a clue, a hint, a sign that would anchor reality once more. Yet the world outside continued in its oblivious rhythm. Mail delivered, lawns mowed, sunlight tracing its arc across the houses, indifferent to the quiet devastation at number 17. Evenings were the hardest. Silence filled the spaces where Anne's voice had once resonated. Meals were eaten in absence, chairs left vacant, the family gathered in a ritual of survival rather than connection. The house seemed to mourn alongside them, creaking with grief in subtle ways, the floorboards sighing under footsteps, doors swaying slightly in the wind, the faint scent of her perfume lingering as if to remind them that her presence had not been erased but suspended. And through it all, Emma and Jacob clung to fragments of hope, whispering to imagined figures, pressing their hands to walls, and wondering if their mother would ever step back through the door that now only reflected shadows. The first officers arrived within the hour, their uniforms crisp and faces etched with professional detachment, though even they could not mask the subtle tension that crept into their gestures. Mark Fletcher explained, again and again, what had happened. The ordinary grocery run, the ordinary morning, the ordinary glance at the clock that had turned into a lifetime of uncertainty. The officers listened politely, scribbling notes with mechanical precision, their pens scratching against the paper like distant echoes in the quiet house. Every detail mattered, they insisted, though it was quickly apparent that details were scarce. Witnesses had seen nothing unusual, no suspicious cars, no strangers loitering outside the store, no sudden movements in the aisles. The ordinary had swallowed in Fletcher without leaving a trace. Outside, the small suburban streets began to fill with neighbors who had heard the news. Some came with a quiet determination to help, others with curiosity tinged by fear. Flashlights were passed, cars formed impromptu search lines, and a sense of community urgency mingled with the growing panic. Yet even as the search extended, every familiar corner seemed indifferent to the sudden intrusion of grief. Lawns, driveways, and hedges bore witness only to the futility of human presence against the vast, impassive ordinary world. The searchers' calls bounced off the walls of houses, over rooftops, and into the wind, swallowed by silence. At the grocery store, investigators retraced her steps with meticulous care. They examined the aisles where she had paused, the cart she had pushed, the cashier who remembered her brief smile. Security cameras were rare in 1989, and the few grainy photographs captured nothing useful. Every mundane detail, the placement of cans on shelves, the squeak of carts across the linoleum, the faint aroma of fresh bread, was now loaded with significance, scrutinized for hints that could illuminate the impossible. Shoppers and employees were questioned repeatedly, their testimonies overlapping yet diverging, revealing nothing concrete. It was as though the store itself had swallowed her presence whole, leaving behind only the memory of her ordinary movements. Back at home, Mark organized the collection of information as best he could. He compiled lists of neighbor statements, notes from phone calls, and any minor anomaly from that morning. Sleep became an elusive companion. At night, he would sit in the living room, the house dark except for the glow of a single lamp, reading over his notes, imagining every possible scenario, a car accident hidden by the wind and shadows, a stranger's cruel hand, and wandering in confusion and lost to memory's labyrinth. None of it seemed plausible, yet every theory gnawed at his mind, each one both horrifying and inadequate. The media arrived in subtle waves over the following days, the small local newspaper printing her photograph and the headline, "Mother Missing from Maplewood Grocery Run." Flyers were posted, photocopies distributed with hope-laden pleas for information. Mark and the children stood silently in front of the camera once, speaking words that trembled with both courage and terror, their voices carried into homes they would never know, hoping someone, anyone, would see, remember, or recognize. But as quickly as the story appeared, it faded. The larger world moved on, leaving Maplewood suspended in a bubble of anxious attention that eventually grew thin, as fragile as the paper the flyers were printed on. In the midst of the investigation, the family faced the subtle erosion of normal life. Every visit by police officers, every call to the station, became a reminder that the world outside had rules, procedures, and timelines that operated independently of human grief. Leads were logged, interviews conducted, but progress was slow, each small possibility deflating quickly in the absence of evidence. There were suggestions of abductions, of mistaken identities, of fleeting glimpses of a woman in a distant town, but none could anchor reality or offer comfort. The officer's well-meaning statements of "we will find her" rang hollow, absorbed by the weight of helpless anticipation. Neighbors offered their own theories, some whispered, some candid, about what might have occurred. The innocence of the street dissolved into speculation, a stranger in a darkened car, a criminal who had been watching, a misstep that led to a tragic accident. Every suggestion, however improbable, carried a seed of fear that rooted itself in the minds of Emma and Jacob. Even in the hours of official investigation, the family's imagination became a stage for the unknown, conjuring shapes and shadows that were as terrifying as reality itself. Sleep was haunted by the sense of being watched, of every ordinary moment containing a hidden fracture. The investigation extended to surrounding towns. Officers and volunteers retraced Anne's probable route, streets, alleyways, even parks where she might have paused. Each location was examined with the slow, deliberate care of someone searching for a needle in an invisible haystack. The smallest traces, a scrap of paper, a footprint, a forgotten glove, were documented, catalogued, and then often dismissed as unrelated. Every potential lead carried the weight of hope, only to dissolve, leaving the family suspended between anticipation and despair. As the days turned into weeks, a pattern of absence settled over the house. Mark became a fixture at the police station, poring over reports and maps, attempting to decode a logic that did not exist. Friends and neighbors began to understand that investigation was not a process that guaranteed answers, it was a ritual of persistence in the face of silence. The children learned the vocabulary of disappearance, missing, unaccounted for, cold case. Their understanding, partial and impressionable, carried the unspoken terror of uncertainty. Each knock at the door, each unfamiliar car passing the house, sent shivers through the household, linking fear with the hope that every arrival might bring news, however small. By the end of the first month, the investigation had uncovered little tangible evidence. There were no confirmed sightings, no anonymous tips that led anywhere, no traces of and beyond the ordinary world she had left behind. The family and the officers alike were forced to confront a stark truth. Some disappearances are not dramatic or violent, they are quiet, almost invisible, leaving a vacuum where certainty should exist. The ordinary becomes alien, the familiar becomes frightening, and every unanswered question weighs heavier with the passage of time. In this silence, the story of Anne Fletcher was no longer just a case, it was an emotional landscape, a terrain of hope, despair, and the subtle tension between memory and reality, which would define the next decades of her family's lives. As the official investigation dragged on with little to show, the quieter, more insidious aspects of disappearance began to take root in Maplewood. Whispers passed between neighbors, in grocery stores, at schoolyards, and over backyard fences. Some stories were innocuous. Someone had seen a car parked outside the store that morning, a shadow moving too quickly along the sidewalk, but they grew in significance through repetition, each retelling draped in fear, uncertainty, and imagination. Small details, once invisible, were magnified into evidence of something unseen. The ordinary streets became charged with suspicion. Every passerby was a potential witness, every stranger a potential suspect. Children at school began to talk in hushed tones. Emma and Jacob's classmates, curious and unrelenting, asked questions that pierced the fragile bubble of privacy the family tried to maintain. Some offered sympathy, some whispered rumors of kidnappings, of strangers in vans, of fantastical tales drawn from the media or overheard adults. Each rumor, no matter how improbable, was absorbed into the texture of the family's anxiety. The boundary between imagination and reality blurred, and grief began to take the shape of conjecture. Every adult in Maplewood had their own theory, yet none could anchor truth. At home, Mark and the children struggled to navigate this shifting psychological landscape. Emma, particularly sensitive to nuance, began replaying conversations and actions in her mind, searching for missed signs or hidden meanings in her mother's behavior. Did she know something? She whispered at night, the question floating in the darkness of her bedroom. Jacob, younger and less verbal, reacted with fear that manifested in restlessness, nightmares, and clinginess. The house became a repository for imagined dangers as much as remembered love. Objects once ordinary, a doorknob, a closet, a street corner, took on symbolic weight. The children's memory of and began to mix with shadowy possibilities, forming an emotional mosaic that was both tender and terrifying. Outside, the neighborhood responded in subtle ways. Windows stayed shuttered longer, porch lights burned later into the night, and casual conversations carried undertones of caution. The Fletcher house became a locus of quiet fascination, with some neighbors offering help, others observing from a distance. Every passerby was measured, catalogued, and folded into the unspoken narrative of what had happened. People began interpreting every small anomaly as a sign, an empty car, a misplaced package, a fleeting figure in the distance. Ordinary life itself became tinged with the awareness that something deeply unsettling had intruded upon the fabric of their community. Local law began to emerge, as communities often do when faced with the unexplainable. Stories circulated of and glimpsed in unusual places, wandering streets or staring out from behind windows, long after she had vanished. Some swore she had been taken by strangers, others that she had left voluntarily, fleeing from circumstances unseen. Each version carried its own weight of plausibility, shaped by personal fears and desires. In the absence of certainty, imagination filled the void. Every rumor became a mirror reflecting the collective anxiety of Maplewood, a town caught between mundane routines and the subtle terror of a mother who had disappeared into thin air. Even casual observers found themselves drawn into speculation. Delivery drivers remembered seeing a woman in a blue coat near the grocery store, though they could not say for certain it was Anne. The cashier recalled a shopper who lingered in the dairy aisle that day, but her memory was hazy and unreliable. Each recollection, no matter how fragmentary, was amplified into potential evidence, feeding the tension within the community and the family alike. The ordinary became uncanny, the known became strange, and in every corner, the unseen loomed large. The psychological toll on the family deepened as weeks turned into months. Every phone call, every knock at the door, became a source of both hope and dread. Mark's frustration grew as he realized that no amount of inquiry could substitute for the certainty of knowing where Anne was, whether she was safe, or whether she might ever return. Emma and Jacob absorbed the ambient anxiety, learning through osmosis that the world could shift in an instant, that trust could fracture, and that absence could carry weight heavier than any tangible object. Their childhoods became a fragile balancing act between memory, imagination, and hope deferred. Even the most ordinary moments were reframed through the lens of speculation. A sudden knock at the door might signal news of Anne, or it might be nothing. A stranger walking past the house could be a witness or a threat. The grocery store itself became a kind of haunted space, the aisles and registers imbued with the echo of absence. Life proceeded in these quiet, uneasy rhythms, punctuated by bursts of hope and waves of despair. Each day, each gesture, each sound carried a resonance it would not have possessed before her disappearance. This period also revealed the subtle fracture between outward normalcy and internal chaos. Maplewood appeared calm on the surface, children went to school, neighbors tended their lawns, traffic flowed as usual, but underneath, the town vibrated with the tension of unanswered questions. Every glance, every pause in conversation, carried the weight of fear. It was a community suspended in limbo, watching, wondering, imagining, and grieving simultaneously. Rumors, half-truths, and speculation became both the connective tissue and the poison, binding the town together while heightening the collective anxiety. In this way, Anne Fletcher's absence extended far beyond her family. It reshaped the neighborhood, altered routines, and seeded a pervasive sense of unease that would linger for years. The ordinary world had been punctured, leaving in its place a network of suspicions, whispered stories, and haunted imaginings. Even decades later, those who lived through it would recall the tension in subtle ways, the fleeting glance at a shadowed corner, the quiet suspicion of strangers, the way silence could carry both dread and longing. The disappearance had transformed Maplewood into a place where ordinary life and extraordinary absence existed side by side, a juxtaposition that would define the narrative of Anne Fletcher long before any diary or stranger appeared to illuminate the mystery further. Time did not heal, not in the way anyone imagined. For Emma and Jacob, childhood had become a series of suspended moments, each one hovering between memory and longing. The days that followed their mother's disappearance were strange and unmoored. Birthdays passed without the warmth of Anne's presence, her chair at the table empty, her gentle voice absent from the ritual of opening presents. School events were attended under the weight of an invisible observer, a shadow of absence that colored every celebration and gathering. Their peers laughed and played, unaware of the tension that pulsed beneath the Fletchers' home, and the children learned early that grief was both private and isolating. Emma, the elder, became acutely aware of the spaces where her mother had once been. She remembered the small things, Anne's hand brushing her hair back as she tied a ribbon, the way she smelled faintly of vanilla and laundry detergent, the sound of her voice reading bedtime stories in a rhythm that felt eternal. At night, Emma would trace the contours of these memories, clutching her pillow as if she could conjure and back through sheer insistence. She catalogued moments in her mind, each memory a fragile bridge connecting her to a world that had been irrevocably altered. The quiet corners of the house, the kitchen counter where they baked together, the living room where they sat for afternoon tea, became sacred spaces, repositories of both love and absence. Jacob, younger and more visceral in his responses, experienced grief differently but no less intensely. His fear was immediate, almost tactile, manifesting in sudden tears, nightmares, and a reluctance to be alone. Ordinary objects, once comforting, now carried the weight of absence. The refrigerator, once a place where and would leave notes or little treats, became a symbol of emptiness. Toys left scattered in their rooms seemed to echo her disappearance, their silence filling the air with a sense of loss. Jacob would often cling to Emma or Mark, seeking reassurance that the world had not completely abandoned them. The house itself seemed to breathe with their anxiety, its walls absorbing the tension and amplifying it in subtle, persistent ways. School became both refuge and trial. Teachers noticed Emma's quiet vigilance, her tendency to replay conversations and interactions, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. Jacob's behavior drew concern, his restlessness and occasional outbursts reflecting a fear he could not yet articulate. Friends, while sympathetic, could not bridge the gap between ordinary childhood experience and the weight of absence the Fletchers carried. Even playdates and casual laughter were tinged with fragility, as the children learned that joy could be shadowed by a sudden reminder of what was lost. Their emotional worlds expanded rapidly, forming layers of resilience intertwined with vulnerability. Mark tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but he too was shaped by absence. His love for his children became both a comfort and a mirror of his own grief, each moment with them underscored by the quiet knowledge of what was missing. Meals were prepared with care but tasted of ritual rather than pleasure. Conversations were held with a cautious tenderness, each word chosen to shield the children from the full weight of reality. Mark found himself oscillating between hope and despair, each day a careful navigation of fractured routines, where the ordinary became extraordinary simply because it was sustained in the shadow of disappearance. The family's home, once a sanctuary, became a landscape of memory. Every room, every corner, every familiar object was charged with significance. Emma could not sit at her mother's favorite chair without feeling the ghost of its warmth, nor could Jacob enter the living room without sensing the absence that seemed to ripple through the floorboards. Ordinary moments, pouring milk, brushing teeth, walking to school, were now imbued with emotional texture, as if the world itself reminded them of the void left behind. Even mundane household chores became acts of devotion, attempts to maintain connection with a woman whose presence had been abruptly severed. Emotionally, the children oscillated between longing and fear, between hope and despair. Emma would sometimes imagine her mother returning, stepping through the door with a grocery bag, a smile, a warm embrace. Other times, she feared that this vision was impossible, that it had been swept away into a world they could not reach. Jacob, in his own way, embodied the rawness of grief, reacting to ordinary events with sudden spikes of emotion, a doorbell, a shadow, a stray sound outside, that reminded him of vulnerability and loss. Their internal worlds were mirrors of the house itself, familiar yet altered, filled with echoes, resonances, and the unanswerable question of where their mother had gone. Friends and extended family attempted to help, offering visits, gifts, and attempts at conversation. While these gestures provided fleeting relief, they could not erase the deep undercurrent of anxiety that ran through the household. Emma and Jacob learned early that grief was not linear. It arrived unpredictably, a sudden gust of wind that unsettled their carefully constructed emotional equilibrium. Over time, these moments became part of their rhythm, a quiet, unspoken knowledge that absence was permanent and memory was fragile. Despite everything, the children also developed resilience. Emma found small ways to assert control over her environment, keeping Anne's belongings organized, writing notes she imagined her mother would leave, and preserving rituals that honored her memory. Jacob, through play and exploration, sought to understand a world that had become uncertain, attempting to navigate fear with curiosity and imagination. Together, the siblings learned to carry the weight of absence, threading it through their daily lives in a way that was both tender and haunting. In these formative years, Anne Fletcher's disappearance became more than an event. It was a shaping force, an invisible architecture that guided their emotional development. Childhood was marked by love remembered, absence endured, and the delicate weaving of hope through the threads of fear. Memory, imagination, and longing merged into a tapestry that defined Emma and Jacob's early years, ensuring that their mother's presence remained alive, not in physical form, but in the constant, intricate pattern of their hearts and minds. Years passed with a quiet, relentless persistence, stretching the edges of time into something almost unrecognizable. The initial urgency of the search, the flurry of police visits, and the sympathetic attention of neighbors gradually faded, leaving the Fletcher family in a fragile limbo. Anniversaries of Anne's disappearance became rituals of quiet remembrance, candles lit on kitchen counters, photographs rearranged on shelves, notes whispered into the empty spaces where her voice had once filled the rooms. Each year, the absence grew heavier, not because it changed, but because the world continued as if oblivious, indifferent to the void left behind. The children, now growing older, carried the weight of these years differently. Emma, transitioning into adolescence, felt the absence acutely in moments of personal growth. Milestones that should have been shared, school dances, first heartbreaks, the simple triumphs of teenage life, were shadowed by the missing figure of her mother. Jacob, navigating the awkward terrain of preteen years, experienced anger, confusion, and guilt in equal measure. Both siblings had learned to mask their fear and longing behind routines, to speak in measured tones when asked about their mother, as though the act of articulating grief could fracture the fragile illusion of normalcy that held the family together. Mark, meanwhile, became a solitary guardian of both memory and routine. His life, once shared in partnership with Anne, was now organized around absence. He managed household chores, work responsibilities, and the children's needs with mechanical precision, a careful choreography that left little room for despair to disrupt daily life. Yet beneath this exterior, the slow gnaw of unresolved grief persisted. Every mundane task, paying bills, driving the children to school, tending to the yard, was infused with the reminder that Anne's presence was missing from every corner. Even laughter, shared in fleeting moments with the children, carried the bittersweet echo of what could have been. The investigation itself, once urgent and comprehensive, transitioned into the slow drag of a cold case. Officers rotated, files grew thick with documentation but thin with actionable leads. Tips arrived sporadically, an anonymous call from someone claiming to have seen a woman fitting Anne's description, a photograph of a distant city street, a vague recollection from a traveler, but each lead dissolved upon investigation, leaving only frustration. The official language shifted, unaccounted for, missing, cold case, words that began as neutral descriptors but became a kind of linguistic weight, carrying both the finality and the ongoing torment of uncertainty. The neighborhood, too, evolved, yet the memory of Anne's disappearance lingered like a persistent shadow. Families moved in and out, children grew up and left, but the Fletcher house remained a quiet locus of collective memory. Occasionally, strangers would inquire about the story, drawn by curiosity, but more often, neighbors treated the family with a careful distance, as though proximity might summon the same grief or uncertainty. Maplewood itself seemed to learn how to live around absence, a community reshaped by one unexplainable void. During these years, Emma and Jacob began to construct their own internal mechanisms for coping. Emma turned to writing and photography, capturing moments and framing them in ways that preserved memory and imposed order. Jacob found solace in movement, in sports, in exploring corners of the neighborhood that were safe and contained. Together, they developed a shared, almost unspoken understanding, and was absent, yet her presence, through memory, ritual, and the emotional traces she left behind, remained central to the architecture of their lives. The world continued, but it was a world refracted through the prism of loss. Mark, aware of the psychological toll on his children, attempted to maintain connection and stability, but even his efforts were haunted by the ineffable absence of Anne. Each milestone, from school graduations to first jobs, carried a subtle grief, a quiet, invisible witness to what should have been shared. Emotional support networks were formed and relied upon. Grandparents, aunts, friends, and sympathetic neighbors provided temporary relief, yet the core wound remained untouched, a slow undercurrent running beneath every gesture and word. Media attention dwindled over the years, leaving the disappearance a faint echo in local memory, replaced by newer stories and more immediate concerns. The initial flood of news coverage, with cameras and headlines, was replaced by sporadic mentions in anniversary columns or retrospectives, small and fleeting. For the family, this absence of public attention mirrored the internal reality. Time did not erase pain, and the world's forgetfulness only sharpened the edges of memory. The ordinary continued in stark contrast to the extraordinary loss that defined their private existence. The cold case became more than a procedural designation, it became a metaphor for the family's emotional state. Every unopened file, every unanswered lead, every failed tip served as a reminder that certainty could not be assumed, that life could fracture without explanation, and that the human heart carries both hope and resignation simultaneously. Emma and Jacob grew into young adults under the heavy weight of unresolved questions, their understanding of the world shaped by the duality of ordinary experience and extraordinary absence. By the end of this period, decades after that ordinary grocery run, and Fletcher's disappearance had transformed from immediate trauma into a persistent, shaping force. It guided the rhythms of everyday life, shaped emotional responses, and colored relationships with subtle, enduring influence. The family's world was a careful balance between memory and forward motion, grief and resilience, absence and the stubborn persistence of hope. The slow passage of time, rather than healing, deepened both the void and the intimacy of recollection, forging a complex emotional landscape that would carry them into the next chapter, where hope and mystery would again intersect in unexpected ways. It was a quiet morning when the first sign of the impossible arrived. The house at number 17, still marked by decades of absence and cautious routines, received an unexpected visitor. The stranger appeared without warning, unannounced, as if emerging from the folds of memory itself. Tall and nondescript, with eyes that carried a hint of familiarity yet remained unreadable, they handed Mark an envelope, sealed and unadorned. No explanation was offered, no preamble, just the quiet exchange of a package that immediately felt heavier than its physical weight. Mark's hands trembled as he took it, a shiver passing through him that mirrored the anticipation, dread, and hope converging in a single moment. Inside the envelope was a diary. Its leather cover was worn and softened by age, faintly scented with something sweet and unmistakably familiar. Perfume, detergent, perhaps the faint trace of a hand long absent. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed with the passage of years, yet the handwriting remained unmistakably Anne's. Mark's breath caught as he opened the first page, the script revealing not only words but the cadence, the rhythm, the intimacy of a voice that had been silent for decades. The room seemed to shrink around him, every sound, children's muted chatter, the distant hum of traffic, falling away, leaving only the texture of Anne's thoughts captured in ink. Emma and Jacob, now young adults themselves, were drawn immediately into the sudden gravity of the moment. The diary was not merely a book, it was a bridge, a tangible piece of the mother they had only partially remembered. Their hands hovered over the pages as if contact could summon her back fully, erase the years of absence, and restore ordinary life. Each turn of a page was a careful act, both sacred and tentative. The room held a reverent silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional intake of breath, as the diary's weight became less about its physical form and more about the emotional gravity it carried. The stranger lingered briefly, silent and enigmatic. Their presence added a layer of tension, a question without immediate answer. Why now, after 34 years? Their eyes, steady yet inscrutable, suggested knowledge and restraint, an awareness of both the family's pain and the fragile hope this gift might inspire. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the stranger left, fading into the street, leaving behind only the diary and a trail of unanswered questions. The family was left to confront a paradox. The gift of connection was intertwined with the persistence of mystery. As Mark opened the diary further, the first entries revealed an intimacy long suppressed, capturing Anne's private thoughts with startling clarity. She wrote of ordinary days, shopping, preparing meals, reading bedtime stories. But these entries were tinged with reflections that hinted at unease, subtle apprehensions, and an acute awareness of the passage of time. The writing was at once familiar and strange, an echo of a woman they thought they knew intimately, yet filtered through the lens of absence and years of unshared experience. The diary became a vessel not just of memory but of revelation, carrying the emotional and psychological traces of a life interrupted. Each page offered a glimpse into moments that had been lost to the family, moments that had persisted only in fragments of memory, and reflected on small joys, the laughter of children in sunlit rooms, the satisfaction of a well-prepared meal, the fleeting beauty of early morning light on Maplewood streets. Yet there were shadows, too, fears she had never voiced aloud, anxieties that had remained private, glimpses of a tension that hinted at the possibility of danger or unease she had felt but could not explain. The diary offered both warmth and unease, intertwining love with vulnerability, ordinary life with extraordinary fragility. Emotionally, the family was unmoored. Emma felt both joy and an ache that cut through the years, joy for the tangible presence of her mother's voice, ache for the decades lost to absence. Jacob alternated between wonder and fear, unable to fully reconcile the diary with the reality of what had been. Mark, holding the diary close, experienced a complex mix of relief, grief, and unresolved longing, realizing that the act of receiving it was not an end but a new beginning, one that demanded engagement with questions that had lingered unanswered for decades. The diary's sudden appearance transformed the house in subtle ways. Ordinary objects, the kitchen table, the chairs, the shelves, seemed to vibrate with renewed significance, as though Anne's presence, captured in handwriting, had infused the space with echoes of life. The family moved through these familiar spaces differently, aware that memory and absence now coexisted with tangible evidence of connection. Even the light from the morning sun seemed altered, illuminating the edges of the room as if to highlight the intersection of past and present. The arrival of the diary also introduced tension, for its existence raised as many questions as it answered. Why had it returned after 34 years? Why had a stranger delivered it rather than through official channels? What had Anne experienced during her disappearance, and what did she leave behind, consciously or unconsciously, within the pages? The family faced a paradoxical combination of hope and unease, a precious connection to the mother they had lost, alongside the weight of mystery that had yet to be unraveled. In these hours, the diary became more than ink and leather. It became a psychological lifeline, a portal into a world that had remained inaccessible for decades. Each word Anne had written carried not only the texture of memory but the unspoken urgency of a life interrupted. For the first time since that ordinary morning in 1989, the Fletcher family felt the presence of their mother, fragile, intimate, and hauntingly real. And yet, with each turn of a page, they were reminded that mystery remained, that absence persisted, and that the passage of time had only deepened the questions that would now guide the next stage of their journey. The diary, once opened, revealed more than the passage of time. It exposed a layer of Anne Fletcher's inner world that had remained invisible to her family for decades. Each page was an intimate confession, a meticulous record of thoughts and feelings that had never been spoken aloud, yet were now present with startling immediacy. Emma and Jacob gathered around the table, their eyes tracing the familiar, looping handwriting that seemed to breathe with life. Mark hovered nearby, both protective and reverent, aware that every word carried the weight of the years they had lost. The diary was not just a record, it was a bridge spanning 3 decades, linking the family to a mother they had never truly known beyond memory and imagination. Anne's entries began innocuously, chronicling the ordinary details of daily life. She wrote of grocery lists, neighborhood walks, and the small joys of parenting, Emma's laughter over a spilled glass of juice, Jacob's insistence on wearing mismatched socks, the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen. Yet interwoven with these ordinary observations were subtle undertones of anxiety and unease. And recorded fleeting suspicions, moments of inexplicable dread, and minor encounters that, at the time, had seemed insignificant. The diary conveyed a duality, the loving, ordinary mother and a woman quietly navigating an undercurrent of tension she could neither name nor share. As the family read, they noticed patterns in Anne's observations. She documented moments when she felt watched, when shadows lingered a fraction too long, or when strangers' behavior sparked a flicker of caution. It was not overt paranoia, but a quiet vigilance that suggested a perceptive awareness of something beyond ordinary perception. Each revelation carried a weight that resonated with Mark and the children, connecting pieces of the past that had been previously unspoken. Emma, particularly sensitive to nuance, shivered as she realized how much her mother had internalized, how much she had protected the children from the subtle fears she carried silently. The diary also revealed the emotional architecture of Anne's mind during those final moments before her disappearance. She wrote about love and longing, fear and hope, blending these emotions seamlessly into her reflections. There were entries capturing her anticipation of Emma and Jacob's milestones, her joy in small domestic triumphs, and her contemplations on life's unpredictability. Yet there were darker entries as well, ones hinting at a tension that had gnawed at her from the edges of daily life, encounters in the street that felt off, cars that lingered too long, and moments when instinct urged caution without clear cause. These entries, read decades later, were both a window into Anne's inner life and a haunting foreshadowing of what had transpired. Emotionally, the diary was a double-edged revelation. Emma and Jacob were flooded with the intimacy of rediscovered connection, yet each page also deepened the ache of absence. The words carried warmth, humor, and love, but they also carried reminders of years spent in waiting, of milestones missed, and of ordinary moments that could never be recovered. Mark, reading silently, felt a mixture of relief and despair. Relief that a tangible connection had returned, despair at the reminder of the void that had persisted all these years. The diary crystallized the complexity of grief, a mixture of closeness and distance, presence and absence, comfort and anguish. The entries also suggested moments that had remained private, experiences Anne had navigated alone during her disappearance. Without revealing explicit details of her location or the events she endured, the diary hinted at encounters, decisions, and challenges that shaped her emotional state. The ambiguity of these passages created tension for the family, offering glimpses of survival and struggle while withholding the specifics that would resolve the mystery entirely. The diary became a delicate balance between revelation and concealment, offering insight while preserving the profound enigma of Anne's vanished years. Reading these passages, the family began to reinterpret their memories of Anne. Ordinary gestures, the way she prepared breakfast, tied shoes, or tucked them into bed, were now imbued with subtle layers of forethought, caution, and emotional complexity. The diary reframed the past, suggesting that the woman they had known was even more resilient, perceptive, and complex than they had imagined. Emma felt a surge of admiration mingled with sorrow, realizing that the mother she remembered had carried private burdens with quiet grace. Jacob experienced similar revelations, though filtered through the lens of instinct and emotion, sensing the bravery behind the familiar handwriting. The diary also sparked questions that could not be ignored. Who had delivered it? Why had it returned after 34 years? What had Anne experienced during her absence, and why had she chosen to chronicle her thoughts without sharing them? The stranger's role in returning the diary added a layer of mystery, raising both hope and anxiety. The family realized that the diary was not merely a personal artifact. It was a message, an extension of Anne's consciousness across decades, demanding engagement with truths that had long been obscured by absence. By the end of the first reading, the diary had transformed the household's atmosphere. The ordinary spaces, kitchen, living room, bedrooms, felt subtly altered, charged with the intimacy and tension of Anne's presence. Each word she had written resonated, creating a sense of proximity and distance at once. The family experienced a complex interplay of emotions: connection, longing, wonder, and unease. The diary offered a renewed lens through which to view Anne, blending memory and revelation, presence and mystery, and forging a path forward that was at once comforting and haunting.